It was a sunny afternoon in the small village, and the laughter of children echoed through the quiet streets. Lila, Jonah, Miles, and Clara were gathered in one of the town parks, where the green grass stretched like a carpet beneath their feet. The sky, blue and clear, seemed like an invitation to adventure. The four friends were in the midst of fun, running and playing among the trees, while the sun cast its warm rays upon them. Lila, with her light brown hair swaying in the wind, was the first to suggest something different. What if we explored the abandoned house on the hill? The mention of the old structure sent a wave of excitement through the group, but also cast a shadow of fear over them. The house, an ancient and weathered structure, was surrounded by legends that spoke of ghosts and disappearances. Jonah, always the most cautious of the group, frowned. "You know they say that no one who entered there ever came back the same, right?" His words, though spoken in jest, brought a chill that spread among the friends. Miles, the clown of the group, gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, come on. What could happen? If we find a ghost, we can ask if it wants to join us for a snack." Clara, always the voice of reason, hesitated, looking at Lila with an undecided expression. But curiosity and excitement were contagious. The idea of venturing into the unknown lit a flame of adventure in their hearts. So after some discussion and teasing, the group decided to move forward. They walked along the trail leading to the hill, their enthusiasm growing with each step. However, as they approached the rusty gate of the house, the atmosphere around them began to change. The sky, which had been clear and sunny, was slowly covered by dark clouds. A cold wind blew, bringing with it a smell of dust and mildew that seemed to emanate from the house. When they reached the gate, the feeling that they were about to cross a threshold became palpable. The sound of rusty metal creaking as it opened echoed like a warning in each of their minds. The house, with its broken windows and peeling paint, seemed to be watching them, as if it was aware of their presence and what they intended. Clara shuddered as she felt an icy breeze that seemed to come from inside the house, like a dark invitation. "Maybe we should think this through more carefully," she murmured, but Lila's determination was unshakable. "Come on, let's not let fear control us," Lila exclaimed, stepping forward while the others hesitated. Jonah exchanged worried glances with his friends, but Lila's energy was contagious. The group united, and together they crossed the gate, feeling a shiver run down their spines as they entered the property. The trees around seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and the sound of birds gradually fell silent, leaving only the echo of their own footsteps. As they crossed the threshold of the main door, a deafening creak broke the silence. The hall revealed itself before them, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if time had stopped there. The dim light entering through the broken windows created dancing shadows, and the feeling that they were being watched intensified. Clara hesitated, stopping at the doorway, while her friends moved forward. An almost inaudible whisper floated in the air, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. "Did you hear that?" Jonah's voice trembled slightly. As he spoke, an inexplicable chill enveloped the group, and the bravery they had felt before began to fade away. The laughter ceased, and the playful atmosphere transformed into a palpable tension. Lila turned to Clara, who was still hesitant. "Come on, Clara, we can't let this scare us now." But Clara, paralyzed by the feeling of unease, only looked at her friends, her heart racing, sensing that something was about to happen. The house, with its worn walls and buried secrets, seemed to be waiting for them, ready to reveal what they never imagined they would find. The group, now inside the house, felt that each room carried a dense and heavy atmosphere. As they entered the first space, a living room covered with furniture draped in white sheets, the sensation was that time had stopped there. Lila, with a mixture of curiosity and unease, approached one of the sheets, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled it. The fabric came loose with a soft whisper, revealing a dusty mirror that, at first glance, seemed like just another forgotten relic. But there was something in the reflection that intrigued her. Looking closely, Lila didn't just see her own face. Something else seemed to stir in the shadows of the glass. An indistinct figure, like an absent presence, formed and quickly disappeared, sending a shiver shiver down the girl's spine. Her friend's eyes turned to the mirror, but they didn't see what she saw. Jonah, Miles, and Clara exchanged confused glances, the tension growing in the air, while Lila slowly backed away, her mind buzzing with questions. "Let's move to the next room," said Jonah, trying to impose a tone of leadership, even though his voice was tinged with hesitation. They moved together, each step echoing in the silence of the place. The next space they found was a closed bedroom, whose walls were covered with faded and torn wallpaper. In the center, an old table displayed a collection of framed photographs, all showing a smiling family. But as they approached, a feeling of discomfort took hold of Clara, who felt her chest tighten. "These photos, they look so old," Clara murmured, her gaze fixed on a specific image. The family in the photos, with expressions of joy, seemed to have been captured in a time that no longer existed, but the absence of their lives sent a chill down the girl's spine. There was something unsettling about those frozen smiles, as if they concealed secrets that shouldn't be revealed. Clara felt as if an invisible presence was watching them. "It's just an old house, full of old things. We can't let ghost stories scare us," Jonah insisted, trying to convince himself and the others that all of this was mere superstition. However, his voice sounded more like a plea to himself than a statement. The others, although reluctant, began to distract themselves from the growing fear with attempts at humor. Miles, always the clown of the group, decided to break the heavy mood. "Maybe this family just moved to a cooler place. Who wouldn't want to live in such a big house?" he said, forcing a laugh that nevertheless sounded nervous and uncomfortable. He tried to imitate one of the family members, but the joke didn't have the expected effect. The silence that followed was deafening, and the looks from Clara and Lila were of disapproval, mixed with growing concern. "Come on, guys, we need to keep going," Lila said, trying to maintain courage. The group moved again, each dealing with their own thoughts. What should have been a fun adventure was turning into a collective nightmare. Fear and hesitation began to infiltrate among them, like the shadows dancing on the walls. As they advanced, the silence of the house became increasingly oppressive. The walls seemed to whisper, telling stories that shouldn't be heard, and unknowingly, each of them was about to confront not only the mystery of that house, but also the fears they carried within themselves, ready to be unearthed. Their friendship, which until then had been unshakable, began to waver under the pressure of the darkness that surrounded them. As the group ventured deeper into the house, the dense and heavy atmosphere seemed to envelop each of them in a bubble of loneliness. Lila moved away from the group, her hesitant steps leading her down a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls, covered with peeling wallpaper, seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and every shadow cast in the faint light made her feel even more isolated. The feeling of not being accepted pursued her like a ghost. She stopped, resting her hand on the cold wall, trying to take a deep breath, but the air seemed thick and difficult to swallow. The echoes of distant laughter tormented her, reminding her of moments when she felt excluded, as if she were an intruder in her own friendship. At the end of the corridor, a half-open door called to her. What was behind it? A welcoming space, or more loneliness? She hesitated, but curiosity pushed her forward. As she crossed the threshold, she was surprised by an empty room, except for a single framed picture on the wall. It was an old painting of a family, their faces blurred by time. Lila recognized a familiar look in the eyes of one of the children, a look that seemed to plead for understanding. In that moment, the pain of rejection intensified, and tears began to slip down her face. In that house, she found not only the loneliness she feared, but the confirmation of her insecurities. Meanwhile, Jonah moved away from the group, seeking a space where he could think. He entered a room full of disorganized books, stacked chaotically, as if someone had desperately tried to organize what could not be controlled. Looking around, a wave of anxiety hit him. The weight of expectations he felt about himself seemed to materialize in those crowded shelves. He had always been the smart one in the group, the one who had answers for everything. But at that moment, the pressure of always being the rational one oppressed him. He found himself surrounded by his insecurities, that behind the facade of knowledge, there was a deep uncertainty about his future. Jonah began to flip through the books, but the words danced in his mind. He felt lost, as if he was sinking in a sea of information without knowing how to swim. Others' expectations weighed on his shoulders, and he wondered if he would ever be able to break free from the image everyone had of him. The sound of turning pages echoed in the silent room, like a lament from his own mind. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, he turned and ran out, determined to find the others, even if it meant facing the darkness of the house. However, the darkness wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Miles entered the kitchen, where the smell of mold and rotten wood invaded his nostrils. He had always used humor as armor, as a way to protect himself from the loneliness that accompanied him. But as he looked around, the kitchen seemed to echo laughter that didn't belong to him. They were laughs from memories of happy moments, but now they became a bitter reminder of his loneliness. He sat in an old chair, his gaze lost in emptiness, while the image of his friends moved away from him, as if he were in an invisible bubble. The echoes of laughter grew louder, resonating in his mind. He wanted to laugh along, but couldn't. Isolation surrounded him, as if the house were mocking him. The kitchen walls seemed to close in, and he felt small and insignificant. It was as if every joke he told was an invitation to friendship, but inside he felt more distant than ever. The laughter that echoed now were just reminders of his internal struggle, a battle that no one else seemed to notice. The friends, each facing their own demons, were more distant than they had ever been. The house, with its dark secrets and echoes of unresolved pasts, watched them with a merciless gaze. They, who sought adventure, found themselves immersed in a labyrinth of fears and uncertainties, ready to discover that not all that glitters is gold, and that often the shadows that dwell within us are more frightening than any ghost that might haunt a house. The oppressive silence of the basement seemed to swallow the group as they approached the locked door. The air, dense and icy, hung like an invisible mist around them. Layla, with a determined gleam in her eyes, looked at her friends and, in an impulse, declared that they needed to find out what was inside. Jonah hesitated, his rational instinct fighting against growing curiosity, but Lila's determination was contagious. Clara, still frightened, exchanged nervous glances with Miles, who struggled to maintain a light expression, although his breathing was rapid. "Come on, it's just a door," said Lila, trying to infuse courage into the group. With a strong push, she threw herself against the door, which, contrary to her expectations, did not open. Jonah, in a moment of courage, decided to join Lila. "Let's break it down," he said, with a firmness that surprised even himself. Miles, although reluctant, joined the pair, while Clara watched them with apprehension, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen growing in her chest. With a joint effort, the group finally managed to force the door, which opened with a deafening creak, revealing a shadowy space. A wave of cutting cold instantly enveloped them, and a shiver ran down each of their spines. In the center of the room, a dark and indistinct figure emerged from the shadows, as if it had been waiting for them. Lila's heart raced, and she felt adrenaline rushing through her veins. In an involuntary movement, they all stepped back, their eyes wide with terror. The figure seemed to pulse with its own energy, a vortex of darkness that defied logic. Miles tried to convince himself it was just an illusion, a trick of the mind, but the oppressive presence made it difficult to maintain any rational thought. Clara, on the other hand, was paralyzed, unable to move or make a sound. Jonah, although gripped by fear, found within himself a spark of courage. "What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty basement. The figure did not respond, but something much deeper began to happen. A wave of emotions took over the environment, and each of the friends began to feel their deepest insecurities manifesting. The shadow that rose before them was not just a specter, but a representation of their fears. For Lila, it transformed into the feeling of not being accepted, a distorted version of herself that challenged her to confront her insecurities. The figure's gaze was penetrating, as if it could see directly into her soul. Jonah, in a moment of clarity, felt the pressure of books and expectations accumulating around him. The figure before him transformed into a myriad of floating books, each representing a responsibility or expectation he felt. He realized he was drowning in his own obligations, and that his relentless pursuit of knowledge isolated him even more. Miles, in turn, was confronted by laughter that reverberated reverberated in the environment, but they weren't laughs of joy. They were echoes of loneliness, memories of jokes that weren't funny enough to fill the void he felt. The figure became a caricature of himself, laughing at him in a bitter way, showing that his humor wasn't a solution, but a mask for his pain. Clara observed the scene, her heart racing, as the shadowy figure divided into multiple forms, reflecting each person's fears. She realized that even among her friends, there was a loneliness that surrounded her. The emotional pressure was palpable, and the idea that each of them was dealing with their own internal battles left her even more distressed. The basement, previously just a physical space, now became an emotional battlefield. The friendship they had cultivated was being tested in ways they never imagined. Insecurities, expectations, and fears intertwined, creating a web of tension that seemed about to break. Each of them, facing their own shadows, began to understand that the real fight wasn't against the shadowy figure, but against themselves. And as the figure moved slowly, as if feeding on their emotions, the group found themselves in a dilemma. What to do in the face of their own fears? The answer seemed to elude them, just like the daylight, which now seemed so distant. The house, with its cold and dark walls, watched in silence, as if knowing that the real battle was just beginning. The atmosphere in the basement was charged, like a heavy cloak that seemed to press down on Lila's shoulders. Before her, a distorted version of herself emerged from the shadows, with eyes that shone with an almost supernatural intensity. The figure's gaze reflected deep insecurities, an implicit challenge that made her question her own identity. "You are not like the others," the figure said, its voice echoing strangely, as if several voices spoke in unison. "You are unique, but that frightens you, doesn't it? Accepting yourself is a burden you cannot carry." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. The idea of being different had always tormented her, shaping her life in a relentless pursuit of acceptance. What did this distorted version of her want? Lila hesitated, but the figure stared at her with an intensity that forced her to confront her most painful truths. "You hide behind smiles and jokes, but inside, you don't feel enough. Why not embrace who you really are?" The voice echoed like a seductive whisper, drawing her into an abyss of doubts. While Lila fought against this terrifying vision, Jonah was in another part of the basement, trapped in a storm of books scattered across the floor. The volumes seemed to come alive, flying toward him, demanding his attention. He had always been the most logical of the group, carrying the pressure of being the smart one, but now that logic seemed to crumble. Guilt consumed him, a weight he couldn't ignore. "You don't live, Jonah. You merely exist within these books," a voice whispered among the pages. "While you hide behind logic, life is passing you by. When was the last time you really allowed yourself to feel?" The words cut like knives, and Jonah felt the desire to free himself from those invisible bonds. He looked around, observing the covers of the books that surrounded him, each representing a part of his life that he never dared to explore. The idea of not making the most of the time he had terrified him. What would happen if he didn't get a second chance? With tremendous effort, he tried to gather the books that oppressed him, seeking to find a way out of that storm of thoughts. In another part of the basement, Miles found himself surrounded by empty laughter that echoed against the damp wall. He had always used humor as armor, a way to protect himself from the loneliness that accompanied him. But now, that laughter sounded like mockery, intensifying his despair. "Look at you, Miles," a voice echoed, mimicking his own jokes. "You think being funny is enough to fill the emptiness inside you? People laugh, but they never see who you really are." The deep wound that Miles tried to hide began to expose its claws. He had always been afraid of being alone, of not being loved, and now he was facing the reality that his humor could not fill the space that loneliness occupied in his heart. The laughter transformed into crying, and he found himself fighting against the tears that threatened to slip down his face. "You can make others laugh, but who makes you laugh?" the voice continued, each word cutting deeper. The basement was immersed in a palpable tension, with each of the friends facing their own demons. Lila, Jonah, and Miles were in internal struggles that separated them even more, despite being physically close. The house, with its cold walls and dancing shadows, seemed to feed on that pain, as if it were waiting for a moment of total weakness. As Lila Lila looked at the distorted figure before her, she felt a wave of determination growing inside her. "I'm not perfect," she declared, her voice firm, though trembling, "but I am who I am, and that should be enough." Jonah, hearing Lila's declaration, felt a spark of hope. He needed to allow himself to live, not just exist. Miles, with tears drying on his face, realized he needed to be true to himself, that laughter had to come from the heart, not from a mask. Together, even in their individual struggles, they began to recognize that the house could not break them. They were stronger than the voices that haunted them, and each in their own way was ready to face whatever might come. The house, full of secrets, seemed to hesitate. The shadows began to dissipate, and a new sense of courage began to fill the heavy air of the basement. The house, previously silent and full of dust, now seemed alive. The whispers that danced between the walls echoed the fears of Lila, Jonah, Miles, and Clara, as if the structure itself was aware of their deepest insecurities. The air was heavy, and each of them felt the growing pressure, as if the ground beneath their feet was disintegrating. The friendship that once united them was crumbling under the emotional weight of the exploration. Lila, with her heart racing, looked at Jonah, who was standing in a corner, his expression laden with distrust and frustration. The need to continue, to discover what else the house was hiding, seemed more like an obsession than an adventure. "We need to leave, Lila. This isn't right. It's not just an old house," Jonah said, his voice trembling but firm. He felt that every second they spent there took them further from reality, and the idea that this could be a mistake began to haunt him. Lila, on the other hand, was determined to explore every corner. "If we leave now, we'll never know the truth. We can't let fear defeat us," she replied, her determination showing in every word. Clara, who was in a complicated position, tried to intervene. "Guys, let's stay calm. We don't need to fight. We're all here together, and that must mean something." But her words didn't have the effect she hoped for. The atmosphere was tense, and fear was infiltrating the cracks in their friendship. Each was fighting against their own demon, and the house seemed to feed on this, intensifying the conflicts. The darkness seemed to deepen, and the corridors, once full of curiosity, were now labyrinths of despair. Meanwhile, Miles, who had remained silent until that moment, began to feel that he was losing control. He had always been the funny one in the group, the one who made everyone laugh, but now his jokes sounded empty, and his laughter couldn't disguise the anguish that consumed him. He moved away a bit, seeking a corner where he could breathe, but the house seemed to close in around him, becoming a prison where his insecurities kept him trapped. Lila, still bubbling with determination, decided she couldn't allow fear to separate them. "Together we can face whatever is here. We need to unite, not let this divide us," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cold corridors. But at the same time, the house seemed to laugh, as if mocking her courage. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and the whispers increased, becoming screams that echoed their anxieties. Suddenly, amid the emotional chaos, the group found themselves involuntarily separated. Each was pulled into a different corridor, as if the walls of the house wanted to test them individually. Lila, in her search for Jonah, ended up in a room that seemed frozen in time, with covered furniture and a thick layer of dust. The silence was deafening, and the feeling of loneliness enveloped her like a heavy blanket. She wanted to scream for the group, but something stopped her. A presence, strange yet familiar, seemed to be watching her. Meanwhile, Jonah wandered down a corridor that seemed to have no end. Every door he tried to open was locked, and the frustration only increased his panic. He began to wonder if there was any point in continuing. The darkness around him seemed to become an extension of his doubts and insecurities. What did he really want? To be the leader of the group, or just a friend? Miles, for his part, found himself in a kitchen where shadows danced on the wall. The echoes of laughter, which were once a source of comfort, were now bitter memories. He realized that his humor wasn't armor, but a mask. The emptiness he tried to hide was there, exposed and defenseless. He sat on the cold floor, feeling loneliness like a weight on his chest. Clara, lost in a forgotten living room, looked around and felt like a stranger in a place that didn't belong to her. The walls seemed to whisper her insecurities, and the need to keep the peace began to crumble. The pressure of being the mediator crushed her. What did she really want? What was enough for everyone to be okay? When they finally found each other again at the end entrance of the house, the feeling of relief was quickly overshadowed by the pain of what they had faced. The house watched, silent and impassive, as they stared at each other, aware that something had changed. The laughter and camaraderie that once united them had become distant echoes, and tension hung in the air, like a dark warning that they were no longer the same.